changed since then? Don't they know that I came from Nebraska? Am I gonna quit? Nice of you to ask, but mama told me go and chase what you after. I'm on track, so I'm gonna rap faster. I'ma break it down for you and get it to the deepest. Laying on that praying under like a grim reaper. Running at the mama to yep, I got a fever. Hi, konnichiwa, are you a believer? Fever, 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 fever. I'ma do it like I wanna do.
Please welcome the best-selling author of Where Good Ideas Come From, The Natural History of Innovation, Steven Johnson.
Okay, so I'm the person standing between you and dinner. It's always a great place to be. I'm really honored to be here. When I was talking to Michael and Deborah about this before, I wrote this book, Where Good Ideas Come From, which is really the kind of culmination of a number of books that I've written over the years about innovation and new ideas in science and in learning and in technology. And we thought it'd be good for this session to just step back a little bit and try and talk about some of my kind of discoveries or things that I've learned in writing this book, which is an attempt to try and spell out the kind of recurring patterns that we see in unusually innovative environments, whether those environments are classrooms, whether those environments are technology companies, whether they're environments like cities or regions like Silicon Valley, and to try and kind of detect underlying patterns that show up again and again in these spaces. So what I wanted to do today is talk to you about a few of those patterns and to talk a little bit about the context of education in all of this as well, both in terms of thinking about how we re-engineer this classroom experience, the school experience, and what it means to be educated, and also how we instill in the next generation of kids and students this capacity for innovation that's so important. So I want to talk to you about 4 or 5 of these patterns today, and the first one is one that I call the slow hunch. The slow hunch comes out of this strange kind of myth that we have that's grown up around innovation, the story that we like to tell about the light bulb moment, the eureka moment, the sudden epiphany. Somehow we have this desire to tell stories of innovation as these moments of sudden clarity, where you're walking down the street and suddenly this light bulb goes off over your head and you have a sudden breakthrough and you see the world differently. But if you go back and you look at the history of innovation, and you really try and kind of rewind the tape and look at great ideas, transformative ideas, disruptive ideas in slow motion to try and figure out what really happened, what you find almost always is that the eureka moment is a myth. That almost always breakthrough ideas are preceded by these long incubation periods where you start with this hunch, this intimation, this idea that there's something out there, that there's a problem worth exploring, but you can't quite put your finger on it. And they often stay in that state for years, sometimes for decades, before they crystallize into something that's truly useful. And it's individuals and organizations and institutions and schools that have the capacity to keep those hunches alive, to give them the time they need to kind of mature and crystallize and germinate. Those people and those institutions tend to be the most innovative ones in the long run. And there are a million examples I could give you, but one is kind of best embodied by this slide, if we could bring it up. This is a pretty technical crowd, so I'm sure more than a few people can figure out what this is. This is a little sticker. The handwriting says, "This machine is a server, do not power it down." The giveaway here is that it says CERN there in the upper left-hand corner. This little sticker was on the original World Wide Web server at CERN, where Tim Berners-Lee invented the World Wide Web, back when the entire web was running off of one machine. So you could literally trip over the power cord and take the entire web down. You'd be like, "I'm so sorry. We should plug that back in. I feel really bad. I took the web down." So the story of how Berners-Lee came to create the web is a classic case study in the slow hunch at work. Right? He starts at CERN as a young programmer in 1982. And he shows up, and it's this very intense, kind of academic environment where you have all these incredibly brilliant people and all these amazing papers being published and all these extraordinary projects that are going on. And he literally, individually, personally, is kind of dealing with the information overload of this space. And so he decides, purely as a little side project, as a hobby, to create a little application for himself to manage all the people and projects and papers that he was encountering there. And he calls it, he names it after this old Victorian kind of encyclopedia, which was called Inquire Within Upon Everything, which is a great title. Could have been a great title for Google, actually. And he calls it Inquire, this first little application. And he builds it, he gets working code, he uses it for, about a year, and then he gets distracted and he, kind of mothballs it. And then a couple years later, in the mid-'80s, he picks it up again and starts toying with kind of a second iteration of it. And this one he decides to call Tangle. The World Wide Web was almost called Tangle. And for this one, he doesn't really get very far. He just kind of sketches an outline of it. And it's not until the late 80s when he finally starts to work in earnest on something that he comes to call the World Wide Web. And this leads to this great moment in the history of kind of office politics where he goes into his superiors and has to say to them, I believe I may have invented a global communications medium in my spare time. Can this be my day job now, please? I'd like to focus on this. And thankfully, they let him continue to focus on it. But it's crucial to the story at this point that not only that Tim Berners-Lee was able to keep this idea alive for this period of time, but he wasn't building it alone. And in fact, this is crucial to everything else I'm going to tell you about innovation, right? He was building on existing protocols and platforms that were already out there, right? So he took the SGML markup language that was already freely kind of floating around, modified it, and turned it into HTML. And of course, he was building on the backs of the internet itself. He didn't have to invent a whole global network of computers connected to each other around the world. If he'd had to do that all on his own in his spare time at CERN, he never would have invented the web. But because Al Gore had already invented the internet, it made it possible. No, that's totally not fair. Al Gore never said that, but whatever, it's irresistible. Because he was able to build on this platform, he was able to build something actually more or less by himself, working with these existing other protocols that were around him. And the other thing that's crucial about the story of the web when we think about innovation here is that, let's say Berners-Lee had that folkloric eureka moment in 1982 on day one at his job at CERN. The fact of the matter is that the world was not ready for the World Wide Web in 1982. There weren't enough personal computers out there, much less network-connected personal computers out there. So just as the idea had to evolve and mature in Berners-Lee's mind, the external world itself had to kind of evolve and catch up to this idea. It wasn't really ripe for it, actually, until Marc Andreessen and Mosaic and then Netscape in 94 and 95. And that gets to another key point about innovation, which is the importance of the context, the surrounding context, in trying to come up with new ideas and new technologies and new platforms. And here, there's a second pattern that involves this wonderful phrase that actually I didn't coin. It's from the biologist and kind of complexity theorist Stuart Kauffman, and the phrase is the adjacent possible. And it's a really useful concept, and it's one that applies just as well to innovation in nature and in biology and in evolution as it does to innovation in culture and in technology and in science. And it goes something like this. The adjacent possible in any system that is evolving over time, where there are lots of different kind of moving parts that are connected to each other in complicated ways. At any given time in the evolution of that system, there's a finite set of moves that are possible, a finite set of ways that the system can be transformed, and a much larger set of moves that can't be made. So think of it like a chessboard, right? Play a game of chess. Halfway through the game, pause the game, look down at the board. There's a finite set of moves that you can make at that point, given the rules of chess. And then there's a much larger set of moves that are illegal given the rules of chess. The set of moves that you can make at that moment in the game is the adjacent possible at that moment in time. And what Kauffman was trying to say about this concept is this is one of these places where biology and human creation are very similar, right? If you think about, if you go back to the primordial soup and you've got a bunch of molecules bouncing off each other, there's no way those molecules are going to spontaneously form a chimpanzee or even a mosquito. They're not yet part of the adjacent possible of life at that particular point. By the same token, no matter how smart you are, no matter how many eureka moments you have, there is no way to invent a microwave oven, say, in 1650. Right? It just can't be done. There aren't enough kind of building block, conceptual parts, technologies, expectations about consumers. just aren't there to make that technology part of it. So when we're innovating, we have to work within this kind of possibility space. We have to think about that context. What are the doors of the adjacent possible that we can unlock at this particular moment? And this is a way of thinking about things that gets to what we sometimes call design thinking. And there's a great example of this in this slide, if we put it back up here. This is a neonatal incubator, one of the great innovations of the last 120, 130 years, invented at the end of the 19th century by a French doctor, done probably more to reduce infant mortality rates than any other technology over the last century. But as we all know, in parts of the world, in the developing world, we still see chronically high infant mortality rates. And so for those of us who are trying to think about how we can deal with this problem, one traditional way is to take a fancy, state-of-the-art, $100,000 neonatal incubator and ship it off to this context of a, let's say in this example, a mid-sized sub-Saharan African town. Get it set up in a clinic there, teaching people how to use it. And in fact, very quickly, you do see this great kind of return on the investment. You see infant mortality rates drop dramatically in the context of prematurely born babies are put in this thing, they stay warm, they survive where they wouldn't have survived, and it's a great success. But then, a year passes, 2 years pass, and a part breaks, some fuse blows, something fails in the system. And because in the context of this mid-sized sub-Saharan African town, there is not a ready supply of spare parts or the on-the-ground expertise to fix this advanced piece of technology. And so what happens is it gets pushed off into a corner, it starts to gather cobwebs, and it never gets turned on again. This is a chronic problem with high-tech aid to the developing world in general, not just neonatal incubators. So a couple years ago, a wonderful group of folks associated kind of loosely with MIT called Design That Matters decided to solve this problem and to solve it precisely through the lens of the adjacent possible. So they went out and they said, okay, we're trying to design an incubator for this context. Let's go and look on the ground and figure out what the adjacent possible for this space really is. And so they did a kind of thick ethnographic survey, in a sense, looking at what forms of knowledge and technological expertise and literally spare parts were available in this context. And what they came back with was, they said, well, listen, you don't see a lot of DVRs and you don't see a lot of microwave ovens in this context, but you do see a working Toyota 4Runner on every corner. And so the technology of automobiles and keeping automobiles in circulation has become part of the adjacent possible of this particular community. So they said, what if we built a neonatal incubator that was made entirely out of car parts? And that, in fact, is what you see right up on the screen, if you put it back up. This is, from the outside, it looks like a sleek, fancy, user-friendly neonatal incubator. And on the inside, it is a Toyota. It uses a fan to circulate the air. It uses headlamps to generate all the warmth. It actually uses door chimes to set off any alarms. And the whole thing will run off a car battery. So if you can fix a Toyota, you can fix this neonatal incubator. Now, what I love about this story is it's not just an example of a good idea. It won Time Magazine's Innovation of the Year award 2 years ago. It's a fantastic idea. But it's not just a good idea, it's a good metaphor for our ideas. Because we like to think of them as state-of-the-art, $100,000 incubators straight from the factory floor. But in fact, in truth, even our best ideas look a lot more like this. They're cobbled together from spare parts that we find around us. No idea comes into being completely sui generis on its own, fully realized. All ideas are fundamentally networks of other ideas put together in some new configuration. And so the trick of being innovative, the trick of creating an environment that encourages innovation, is on some basic level to figure out ways to put more spare parts on the table, to allow a more eclectic, more diverse assemblage of building block ideas to be available to both teachers and creators and students in the environments that they work and, in some sense, in the environments that they play. So the question is, what are those kinds of environments? What properties do they have? And in the book, and in fact in all my books, I've looked at a lot of them, and I've started to give them this name to kind of describe their general properties, and the name is that they're liquid networks. They're environments where there is a certain kind of fluidity of exchange and diversity of kind of perspectives that allows ideas to jump from one mind to another. Economists have a great term for this when they talk about the innovative capacity of cities and dense urban neighborhoods. They call it information spillover. It uses that same liquid metaphor. And when you crowd people together, you get this interesting phenomenon where ideas just kind of bounce from mind to mind, and through those unlikely serendipitous collisions, interesting new configurations happen. The adjacent possible expands because there are more kind of configurations possible because the minds are so closely connected to each other. If you think about it in terms of physics, it's like that fertile middle ground between too much chaos of a gas and too much stability of a solid, that liquid zone where ideas are so much more likely to emerge. And as I said, I look at a lot of these examples in the book and in a bunch of my books, but maybe my favorite example of a liquid network at work is the 18th century coffee house, which actually the first British 18th century coffee house, the first coffee house in the history of Britain actually was in Oxford, and the first two were in Oxford. So coffee houses have this kind of deep, long connection with university academic culture, which is not a coincidence. The 18th century coffee house in Europe was one of the great drivers of innovation in that period. If you had to figure out where the kind of the seat of the Enlightenment was, where physically, what physical space did the Enlightenment happen, you would be wrong to point to a kind of corporate boardroom or a university lecture hall. In many ways, the Enlightenment was a child of coffee house culture. Lloyd's of London was originally Lloyd's Coffee House, right? It was the local gathering place where the ship captains and the merchants and the local investment community would get together, and over coffee they would talk about this incredibly risky but incredibly profitable business of sending ships all around the world. And over conversations there, they started to think about how you could take a little risk out of that business, and in that process, the modern insurance business as we know it was created. Ben Franklin, I wrote about this in a book called Invention of Air that I wrote a few years ago. Ben Franklin, in the many years he lived in London, used to hold court in this place called the London Coffee House, which was this amazing scene. He had this group called the Club of Honest Whigs, where they would get together, Whigs with an H, the political Whigs. And they would get together and they would talk about electricity, and they would talk about chemistry, and they would talk about the American political situation, and they would talk about new ideas in religion, and on and on and on, drinking way too much coffee. And over the course of these conversations, there was just an extraordinary stream of new ideas and breakthrough collaborations that came out of this network at the London Coffee House. I actually went back a few years ago when I was researching this book to figure out if there was a plaque where the London Coffee House was, because there's a plaque on just about everything in London, and this was a really important space in the history of the Enlightenment. And there's no record of it at all, but there is, I swear to God, a Starbucks right there. Right at this exact spot. So they have no idea, but they're kind of keeping the torch alive for the memory of this important space. The question is, what was it about the coffee house that made it so generative? What was it about that space that made it such a driver of new ideas? And there are two answers to that question. One is a little bit of a detour, but it's worth sharing. And that first answer is the simple fact that they were drinking coffee. Because until coffee and tea became affordable enough for both kind of the mass audience and elites to drink somewhere around early 1700, until that point, the daytime beverage of choice for all of Europe was alcohol, right? People would wake up in the morning, they would have beer for breakfast, they would have a little beer through the morning, then they would have a little wine at lunch. In the 1600s, there were these huge gin epidemics where people were just drinking gin all day and going insane. And the reality of life, the historians don't really talk about this enough, but the reality of life was that people were just drunk all day long. That was, and it was the healthy choice, which was a funny thing, because the water wasn't safe to drink. And so people were like, I would love to drink the water, but I must have this beer with my breakfast. And so when coffee and tea, this sounds like a joke, but there's a lot of serious scholarship to support this. When coffee and tea were introduced in 1700, you had, in a sense, this mass change in the bloodstream of Europeans who had been basically drinking depressants all day long and suddenly switched over to these stimulants. And it's no accident that there was this great flowering of intellectual activity. Everybody was just a little bit more alert. So there's this part of the story of coffee and tea that is directly related to the productivity of of the 18th century, which was an incredibly productive both physically and intellectually, century. But the other point that's just as important is that the coffee house was a multidisciplinary space. It was a space that was not organized around a single firm, a single kind of intellectual perspective, a single interest. It was a space populated actually by people who were very eclectic and diverse in their interests. And it was crucially, and this is a word we've heard a lot today, it's a word I've been writing about more and more, it was a space where networks of peers could get together. These were not spaces where people regularly gave lectures. They were places where people got together all working on the same level in the hierarchy, who were brought together not because they were trying to solve a particular problem, but because they were trying to, in a sense, expand the possibility space around them, to collaborate and trade ideas and share new insights and talk about their hobbies and talk about their passions. And it was that open-endedness and that cross-disciplinarity that made it so powerful, that led to so many new links. You think about someone like Ben Franklin. I mean, he was a coffee house just when he dined alone, to paraphrase Kennedy about Jefferson, right? I mean, he had so many interests. So he was constantly, by keeping all these hobbies alive in his life, he was constantly kind of colliding with them in new ways and going off on these new tangents. And what that takes you to then, in a very important way, I think, is a different perspective on the importance of diversity in thinking about both innovation and our social health and progress, right? This is not the traditional diversity, kind of the multicultural argument, the political argument, the social tolerance argument for diversity, which is a great argument. It's an important argument, and in many ways it's been steadily winning over the last 50 years. But there's an additional argument here as well. It's not that we want to be in diverse environments so that we'll be more tolerant and more open to other ways of life or other perspectives, is that if we surround ourselves with people who are different from us, particularly people who have different interests, we will be, on some fundamental level, smarter, more creative, more open to new possibilities. We will have more building blocks on that table. We'll have more spare parts. A couple of years ago, there was a great study by a Stanford business professor named Martin Roif. And Roif was interested in the social networks of unusually innovative people. And this was the kind of study that was incredibly hard to do when Roif was doing it 10 years ago. Now it's incredibly easy because that whole network is mapped on Facebook or on Twitter and LinkedIn. So what he did was he created this kind of study where he had two cohorts that he studied, one of which was made up of people who had been unusually innovative in their careers. And then there was a second group that had, to put it gently, been a little less innovative in their careers. If they call you up and ask you to be part of that part of the experiment, just hang up the phone. Like, you seem very dull. Could we ask you about your friends? Don't talk to them. It won't end up well. But he did this analysis. He asked everybody to kind of map. He created these elaborate social network maps of everybody's acquaintances. And what he found was that there was this signature pattern on the innovative side of the question, which is that the innovators had far more kind of loose, weak tie connections to a much more diverse range of professions than the less innovative group. So one of them was a university administrator on one side, but they were friends with a poet and an architect and a government contract lawyer and a popular science writer. Whereas the other one just knew other university administrators. And from everything that we've just talked about, you can understand why this makes sense. It's that casual conversation with your friend, the architect, who's working on a totally different kind of problem. But there's something in their discussion of what they do and the kinds of solutions that they've come up with that triggers a new insight or a new connection, expands the adjacent possible just a little bit in your own particular point of view. And it's those collisions across borders that are such powerful kind of openings for new ideas. And of course, a great opportunity in school systems, where we, by definition, have a lot of people who are working on different kinds of problems with different kinds of focus. Whenever I talk to a high school or a college or a bunch of grad students, I always try and say, remember that you have this great diversity of interests here, and that when you leave here, all the forces in your life are going to try and specialize you. They're going to try and put you into a job, put you into an industry, put you into a specific field. And while you're in school, you have this opportunity to diversify and to stumble across new things and make new connections. And it's that movement of ideas across borders that so often leads to truly disruptive new ideas. I mean, we just saw Bill Campbell up here. There's a great example of this in the history of Apple. When Apple was trying to figure out what to do with its retail stores, before they had launched their first one. I mean, it's hilarious to think about this, but this was an idea when it was first leaked that was widely mocked, right? People thought Apple was going to open these retail stores and malls and, in downtown areas. What did they know about retail? This was going to be a disaster, all this kind of stuff. A normal company would have said, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're opening up a consumer electronics store, so we better go study the competition. And they would go and they would study the competition and figure out how to do it slightly better. And so they would go and they would study Best Buy or Radio Shack, maybe right there, Shack is in the title, that's a sign something is going wrong. But they would go and look at all these things, and then they would try and incrementally improve on it. But Apple, being Apple, wanted to think different, wanted to reinvent the experience, do something totally different. And so they said, well, listen, we want to look at an environment where customers feel like they have just an incredible experience, and they love it, and they want to come back. So they sent a bunch of people to study high-end 5-star hotel chains. I'm sure they studied the Phoenician. But they actually sent some people to the Ritz-Carlton training program. And when they came back, they said, well, what is it? What's the magic? What is it that people love about a 5-star hotel? And they said, well, we think one of the things they really love is the concierge. They really love a high-end hotel concierge where you go to the concierge and whatever you want, they will solve for you, right? You're like, I want to take a hot air balloon over Scottsdale right now. And they're like, I'm on it. I can go do it, right? So they said, well, how can we take that idea, that concept, and port it over into a completely different space? What happens when you think about a high-end hotel concierge in a consumer electronics store? Well, that became the Genius Bar, right? The Genius Bar is that idea kind of borrowed from one field and ported over and put to use in a new context. That is so often the case. When you think about the history of technology, you think about all these technologies that were invented for one purpose that turned out to be surprisingly good at something else. And so it's those migrations across borders that we have to kind of actively seek out, even though we don't know what they're going to lead towards. We don't know the borrowing we're going to have from some other field, but we have to diversify our intake and our experiences to have those kinds of things. And that, to me, is one of the great opportunities that we have in the classroom, not just in thinking about how the classroom can change, but in thinking about what we can do in the classroom. And this is one of these places where I think kind of the world of online learning, but also particularly simulations, almost game-based learning, can be incredibly powerful in teaching kids to think in this multidisciplinary way and to make connections across borders and not just focus on single fields. So I'll give you just one example. This is something I've actually never written about. It's something I've just been kind of living the last year or two. There's this extraordinary game that I bet no one has heard of. It's a game called Dawn of Discovery. Has anybody heard of this game? Okay, there we go. We got one person. I've almost never heard anybody else. And it's a beautiful game. We bring up the slide. You can see it's a game that simulates basically kind of a 16th century trading empire. And it's got great graphics. This is not an educational game at all. But it's an enormously complex game where it's a classic kind of simulation, a little bit like SimCity or Civilization, if you know those games, where you have a set of resources and you start by building a little community and you have objectives, but you control basically your destiny, you control what you want to do. There's a lot of open-endedness to the system. And in this game, you can basically, kind of start with this little town and build up this huge trading empire. And it's really great to look at, and it's a really kind of vivid world. And for a while there, I was playing it with my two older sons, who were at the time 10 and 8. And we were playing two different versions of it. One basically, you can choose to just be a merchant and live as peaceful a life as possible and just amass a great fortune trading. Or you can build a great naval fleet and take over kind of neighboring islands and conquer them and gather all their stuff, but get into these big battles with other places. And so for a while, we were doing this thing where I was playing one version of the simulation, and then my boys were playing a separate one. And I was building this great merchant kind of empire, and they were, of course, building a giant naval fleet and going and blowing things up. And they kept having their ships burning down and sinking, and they'd have to rebuild their fleet, and so they kept running out of money. And every morning they would come out and be like, Dad, I ran out of money. And I was like, wow, look at all this cash I've got stockpiled here. And so it was literally a lesson in the costs of war, playing this kind of A/B testing version of this game. But the really important thing about this simulation is the diversity of kind of conceptual fields that come together in trying to get to the end of the game. One of the things you do in the game is you can decide to build a cathedral. So this is a cathedral under construction if you flip back to the screen. Now, I'm just going to give you just the surface of the things you have to think about if you want to build a cathedral. First thing you have to do is you have to have stone quarries that you've developed to be able to do this. You have to have nobles. You have to have kind of built a wealthy enough society that you have nobles in the community before you're allowed to build a cathedral. You have to raise enough money to actually build the cathedral. So you have to set your tax rates high enough that you have funds to build the cathedral, but not so high that people leave. The nobles won't show up unless they have very sophisticated spices. So you have to go off and get these spices from other countries around this kind of little world. So that means you have to build a spice trade, and to some extent you then have to build these warships to support the ships that are going around. Otherwise they're going to get attacked and raided by pirates. This is just a sliver of the things you have to think about simultaneously to get to the ability in the game to build a cathedral. So think about then the kind of mental interpretive models that my kids are using to do this for fun on Saturday morning, right? They have to simultaneously think like an urban planner and just deciding where the cathedral should go and whether they should build it. They have to be a kind of proto-industrialist and create these big stone quarries. They have to think like a sociologist and thinking about the nobles and the different castes of society. They have to think like a city mayor to set the taxes. They have to build these little farms to get the spices in the first place. They have to work like a merchant to build up the spice trade, and they have to think like an admiral to build the navy to support the spice trade. All those thoughts are happening kind of simultaneously in their heads as they're playing this game, and they're putting all these different points of view and perspectives on the world on this problem for fun. They would do it for 10 hours straight if I let them. They have no idea the kind of complexity of the problem solving. They're going off to school and they're being taught, basic multiplication. They're going home and they're building a vast spice trade and building cathedrals. And so I think there's something in that kind of structure, in that kind of technology, that is not just good in terms of getting people to think about complex systems, but also think about multiple disciplines, and to allow those multiple disciplines to converge on a single problem in a really productive way. And I think that's one of the great opportunities that we have now. We have the technology, we have an understanding of how this technology works, we have an understanding of how the brain is drawn to these kinds of problems in these types of environments. So I think in some ways we talk about, kind of building cathedrals of learning, but in some ways what we want to be building are spaces like this one, where the kids are learning to build cathedrals instead. So that, to me, is the kind of environment, whether it's on a screen, whether it's in a simulation, whether it's in a classroom, is the kind of environment where we really will see new ideas emerge in the coming years. It's exploratory, it's cross-disciplinary, it's playful, and it expands the adjacent possible in all these ways that we can't really predict in advance. That's where good ideas come from. Chance favors the connected mind. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much for coming. This concludes tonight's programming. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Understand nothing.